Some men are born to bear the burden of others. They grow up under the weight of traditions they didn't choose, bound by codes of honor that turn their lives into gilded prisons. In the Old West, where a man's word was worth more than gold, certain promises were heavier than iron chains. Thomas Mitchell knew well the weight of promises. By the age of 42, he had inherited more than land and cattle when his father died the previous winter. He had inherited a responsibility that haunted him like a restless ghost. The Mitchell Ranch stretched for miles under the unforgiving Texas sky, but Thomas felt more like a prisoner than an owner. His sun-tanned skin bore the marks of years of working in the brutal heat, and his blue eyes had the hardness of someone who learned early on that life in the West does not forgive the weak. Dust danced in the warm morning air as Thomas observed the horses in the pasture. The dry wind carried the smell of parched earth and the promise of another scorching day. He adjusted his hat over his grey hair and sighed. His every move revealed a man accustomed to hard work, but his hunched shoulders betrayed a weight that went beyond the physical. The ranch's big house stood like a lonely fortress in the barren expanse. Its wooden planks creaked in the heat, telling stories of storms faced and years of loneliness. Thomas had grown up in those walls, watched his mother languish and die young, watched his father become a bitter and controlling man. Now, at 42, he found himself trapped by his father's last will like an animal in a trap. The will had been clear and cruel in its simplicity. To keep the ranch in the family, Thomas must marry Eleanor, the young widow his father had married just 2 years before he died. The age difference between them was a chasm that seemed unbridgeable. She was 26, he 42. Even crueler was the fact that Thomas had known Elena since he was a child, when she played with his rag dolls, while he was already taming wild horses. Elena Martinez had arrived at the Mitchell Ranch as a delicate rose transplanted into rocky soil. His black hair shone even in the western dust, and his brown eyes held a deep sadness that Thomas recognized well. She had married her father out of necessity, not love, a common practice in hard times when single women rarely survived in the Wild West. The sudden death of old Mitchell had left Elena in a vulnerable position. With no close family and no resources of her own, she depended on the Mitchells' generosity to survive. The will had been the last move of a controlling man, forcing his son into an impossible situation. Thomas could forgo the ranch and see Elena destitute, or accept an arranged marriage that would benefit both of them, but destroy any chance of true happiness. The days dragged on like long shadows in the late afternoon. Thomas avoided Elena whenever possible, communicating through Sarah, the elderly housekeeper, who had been running the house for decades. But the presence of the young widow was constant, like perfume that remains in the air even after the flower withers. He saw her in the windows, tending to the small garden he had planted, feeding the chickens in the yard. Elena moved around the house like an elegant ghost, respectful but distant. The weight of the decision grew with each passing day. The neighbors were already whispering on their trips to the city. Some supported unity, seeing it as a practical solution to 2 problems. Others considered the situation inadequate, a violation of the social norms that governed their rigid lives. Thomas felt the looks and heard the murmurs, but his greatest concern was in the young woman's heart that had become his involuntary responsibility. During the lonely nights, Thomas walked through the fields under the endless stars. The immensity of the night sky made him feel small and lost. He thought of the cruel irony of his situation, heir to a land empire, but a prisoner of a choice that was not his own. The Mitchell Ranch had been built with sweat and blood over generations, but now it felt more like a curse than a blessing. The pressure was mounting as creditors began to question the legal status of the land. Without marriage, the will left loopholes that greedy men could exploit. Thomas knew that it was not only his freedom that was at stake, but also the future of Elena and the workers who depended on the ranch for survival. The weight of so many lives in his hands was suffocating like the still air before a storm. And then, one morning of relentless sunshine, when the heat was already promising to be brutal even before breakfast, Thomas made a decision that would change their lives forever. Thomas found Elena in the garden when the sun was still battling the morning mist. She was kneeling among the vegetable beds, her delicate hands working the land with almost motherly care. Her simple blue cotton dress was stained with damp earth, and a few strands of hair escaped from the scarf that protected her shoulders from the dew. There was something pure about that scene, as if Elena were the only living thing in a world that insisted on dying under the relentless sun. She looked up when she felt his presence. For a moment, Thomas saw in that look the girl who used to run through the fields when he was still young. But the years had scarred Elena in subtle ways. Little wrinkles in the corner of her eyes, a more cautious posture, the way her hands trembled slightly when she was nervous. Her marriage to her father had robbed her of the carefree youth that Thomas remembered. The conversation that followed was brief and painful, like a poorly healed wound. Thomas explained the legal situation, the approaching deadlines, the pressure from creditors and neighbors. Elena listened in silence, her hands still holding a handful of dirt, as if it was her last connection to something real and tangible. When he finished speaking, she simply nodded and said she understood. There were no tears or protests. Elena had learned that in the West, women survived by accepting what they could not change. The decision was made on a Tuesday morning, when the heat already promised to be unbearable. Thomas sought out Reverend Peterson in the town's small wooden church, an elderly man who had married 3 generations of local families. The Reverend knew the situation and did not ask unnecessary questions. They scheduled the ceremony for the end of the week, something simple and discreet without celebration or party. It would be a marriage out of necessity, not joy. The preparations were minimal and melancholy. Elena sewed a new dress using plain white fabric that Thomas had bought in town. It wasn't a traditional wedding dress, but rather something practical that she could wear afterwards to her daily work. Sarah, the housekeeper, prepared a simple cake and decorated the main room with wildflowers gathered from the fields. The result was touching in its simplicity, as if the house tried to feign joy in a situation that everyone knew was just survival in disguise. The night before the wedding, Thomas couldn't sleep. He walked to the stable and talked to Thunder, his most faithful horse, as if the animal could offer advice that no human would be able to give. Thunder was a black Mustang that Thomas had tamed when he was still young and full of dreams. Now, at 16, the horse had grey fur around his eyes, a mirror of Thomas's own life. Both had grown old, stuck in the same place, carrying responsibilities they had never chosen. Elena spent the night sewing final details on her dress. Her hands worked with mechanical precision, but Thomas noticed through her bedroom window that she stopped frequently to wipe her eyes with the back of her hands. She was weeping, silently, as strong women had learned to cry in the West, without making a sound, without disturbing anyone, without expecting consolation that rarely came. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm. Thomas put on his best suit, a dark outfit he had worn only at funerals. Elena appeared in the room wearing the simple white dress, her hair tied in an elegant bun, a few wildflowers intertwined in the dark strands. She looked beautiful in a heartbreaking way, too young for so much sadness, too strong to give up, too proud to show despair. Reverend Peterson arrived punctually at noon. With him came only 2 witnesses, Dr. Hendricks and his wife Martha, long-time neighbors who had known the Mitchell family for decades. The ceremony was conducted in the main room, modestly decorated with flowers and a few green branches. The Reverend spoke about commitment, responsibility, and the bonds that unite people in difficult times. He carefully avoided mentioning love or happiness. When it was time for the vows, Thomas and Elena looked at each other for the first time since the ceremony began. In her eyes, he saw resignation mixed with a fierce dignity that impressed him, Elena wasn't getting married just out of necessity. She was choosing to survive with grace, turning an impossible situation into something she could endure. Thomas felt a twinge of respect for the woman who was about to become his wife. They exchanged simple rings that Thomas had bought the day before. Elena's hands trembled slightly as he slid the golden ring onto his finger, but his voice remained steady during the vows. Thomas noticed that his own hands were not much more stable. The situation was strange and painful for both of them, but there was also something solemn about that moment, as if they were sealing a pact of mutual survival. After the ceremony, guests shared the simple cake and a few polite words about the future of the ranch. Doctor. Hendricks shook Thomas's hand with excessive force, his eyes conveying a silent message of support. Martha hugged Elena affectionately, whispering something in her ear that made the young wife smile for the first time that day. It was a sad but genuine smile. When the guests left, Thomas and Elena were left alone in the house they now officially shared. The silence between them was as heavy as the still air before a summer storm. Elena collected the plates and glasses, moving around the house with the efficiency of someone who already knew every corner. Thomas watched her work, noting the gracefulness of her movements, the way she took care of every detail with almost reverence attention. On that first night as husband and wife, they established the silent rules that would govern their marriage. Elena would take the room she had shared with Thomas's father, a spacious room on the upper floor. Thomas would remain in his old room, across the hall. They would share meals, house and ranch responsibilities, but maintain a respectful distance that protected the dignity of both. But what neither of them expected was how the small gestures of courtesy would begin to create unexpected bonds between them. The weeks following the wedding brought a strange but functional routine. Thomas discovered that Elena woke up before dawn to prepare coffee and fresh bread, her silent movements in the kitchen like a morning dance that he came to wait without admitting it. She left her cup ready on the table, always at the right temperature, always accompanied by a slice of bread that was still warm. They were small gestures, but loaded with a care that Thomas had not experienced in years. Elena, for her part, noticed that Thomas always checked the locks on the doors before bed, a routine she began to look forward to as a sign that the house was safe. He cared for the horses with a gentleness that contrasted with their rough appearance, talking to the animals in a low voice, treating each wound with the patience of a father. There was kindness in this man she was beginning to discover, a compassion hidden under layers of loneliness and responsibility. The first moment of true connection happened on a stormy afternoon. The wind howled around the house like a wounded animal, and the rain pounded against the windows with a force that made the wooden planks tremble. Elena was in the kitchen preparing dinner when an especially loud rumble of thunder sent the pots rattling on the shelves. Thomas saw the fright in her eyes, and for the first time he realized how young and vulnerable she was, despite all her dignity. He approached slowly, as he would a frightened colt, and stood by the window watching the storm with her. Elena had turned pale, her hands shaking slightly as she stirred the soup on the stove. Thomas realized that she was afraid of storms, a deep, childlike fear that she had probably carried since she was a child. Without saying a word, he grabbed a chair and sat down by the kitchen window, his quiet presence offering protection without embarrassment. That night, Elena served dinner with a shy smile, the first genuine smile Thomas had seen since their marriage. It was a small smile, but it transformed his face in a way that made his heart race involuntarily. They ate in companionable silence, the sound of the rain gradually diminishing until it became just a gentle patter on the roof. When Elena got up to collect the plates, Thomas did something that surprised her, offered to help. From that night on, small changes began to happen in the Mitchell household. Thomas went on to help Elena with the heavier chores, carrying buckets of water, fixing broken things she casually mentioned. Elena began to take care of his clothes more closely, sewing loose buttons, mending tears with meticulous care. They developed a silent language of mutual kindness that neither of them had planned. The real test came when Eleanor fell ill with a high fever on a particularly hot week in July. Thomas found her collapsed in the kitchen one morning, her coffee spilled on the floor and she shivering in the sweltering heat. Without hesitation, he carried her to her room and sent for Dr. Hendricks. During the 3 days Elena spent in bed, delirious with fever, Thomas cared for her with a dedication that surprised himself. He changed cold cloths on her forehead, forced her to drink water when she could wake up, and slept in a chair next to the bed to be close in case she needed help. Sarah, the housekeeper, watched everything with wise eyes, noticing how Thomas spoke softly to Eleanor even when she couldn't hear, how gentle his hands were when he adjusted the blankets, how his eyes never strayed from her face for long. When the fever finally broke, Elena woke up to find Thomas asleep in the chair next to her, his face scarred by worry even in sleep. She watched him for a long moment, noticing details she had never noticed before. The fine wrinkles around her eyes, the small scar on her left temple, the way her grey hair curled over her forehead. There was humanity in that face that went beyond responsibility and duty. When Thomas woke up to find her eyes clear and fever-free, the relief in his expression was so genuine that Elena felt something move in her chest, a sensation she had forgotten was possible. He asked her how she felt, with a tenderness that made her realize that it was no longer just her responsibility. It was her real concern, her sincere care. Eleanor's recovery brought a new dynamic to the house. She spent more time on the porch in the afternoons, watching Thomas work with the horses and cattle. He started coming home early, finding excuses to stay close to the house when she was busy with her activities. They started chatting over meals, small conversations about the weather, the ranch, the animals, but that gradually deepened. Thomas discovered that Elena read books, a rarity in a region where many women could barely write their names. She had learned from an aunt, educated in the big city, before coming west. He began bringing books to her when he went into town, carefully choosing titles he thought she might like. Elena was visibly happy with each new book and began to tell him the stories she read, her words painting worlds Thomas had never imagined. One night, as Elena told about a book of seafaring adventures, Thomas found himself watching the excitement on her face, the way her eyes sparkled as she described the storms at sea and the distant lands. He realized he was beginning to see her not as his father's widow or an inherited responsibility, but as Elena, an intelligent, brave, and surprisingly strong woman who had found ways to create beauty, even in the most difficult circumstances. But it was on a starry night in August that everything changed irreversibly. Thomas was in the corral taking care of a mare that was going to have a foal when Elena showed up with hot coffee and watched the work. When the foal was finally born, healthy and strong, Elena let out a sigh of joy that made Thomas look at her. In the glint of her eyes under the starlight, he saw something that took his breath away. She was no longer pretending to be happy. It was real, shared happiness, a moment of pure joy that connected them in ways neither of them expected. And at that moment, Thomas understood that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer two strangers forced to share a house. They were partners, companions, and maybe, just maybe, something else that neither of them yet had the courage to admit. Autumn arrived at the Mitchell Ranch, bringing with it a transformation that went far beyond the leaves that changed color. Thomas and Eleanor had found a rhythm of life that neither of them had imagined possible when they married out of necessity on that hot summer morning. Now, when Thomas returned from the fields at the end of the day, he looked for Elena with his eyes, and when he found her, he felt a peace he had forgotten was possible. The first time Thomas realized that his feelings had completely changed was one morning in October. Elena was in the garden picking the last pumpkins of the season, her blue dress contrasting with the gold of autumn. The morning sun lit up his hair in a way that made his heart race. It was no longer the responsibility he felt for her, nor the gratitude for her care. It was something deeper, more dangerous, more real. He had fallen in love with his own wife. Eleanor also felt the change, although she struggled to understand it. When Thomas looked at her during meals, there was something in her eyes that made her blush like a young single woman. When he passed near her in the house, his heart raced in a way that hadn't happened in years. One night, while mending one of his shirts, Elena found herself smiling for no reason, simply because the piece of clothing smelled like him. Leather, honest workmanship, and something indefinable that was only Thomas's. The growing tension between them reached breaking point on a light, rainy afternoon in November. Thomas had cut extra wood for the coming winter, and Elena insisted on helping him pile the logs in the barn. Working side by side, their hands touched as they picked up the same piece of wood. It was an accidental touch, but they both stopped as if they had been struck by lightning. They looked at each other for a moment that seemed eternal. In Elena's face, Thomas saw the same conflict he felt, the struggle between what they had agreed to be and what they were becoming. Elena saw in her eyes a silent question that she didn't know if she had the courage to answer. The air between them vibrated with unspoken possibilities, with desires that neither of them had planned to feel. It was Eleanor who broke the silence, her voice coming out lower than usual. She said there was something she needed to tell him, something about the time she was married to her father. Thomas waited, feeling like he was about to hear something that would change everything between them forever. With the courageous honesty he had grown to admire, Elena confessed that she had never loved his father, that she had married only to survive, but that now, for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to choose to be with someone. Elena's confession opened the floodgates of honesty between them. Thomas told of the years of loneliness, of how he had resigned himself to a life without true love, of how her presence had brought light to dark corners of his soul that he thought were dead forever. They talked about fears, hopes, about how an arranged marriage had become the most real thing either of them had ever experienced. When the sun went down that afternoon, Thomas and Eleanor were no longer two strangers sharing a house out of obligation. They were a man and a woman who had chosen to love each other, who had turned necessity into desire, duty into devotion. The first night they truly spent together was sweet and respectful, full of tenderness, accumulated over months of mutual care and quiet kindness. The winter that followed was the happiest either of them had ever known. Thomas taught Elena how to ride her most docile horse, and she accompanied him on walks through the frost-covered fields. Elena read to Thomas on the long nights, her voice transforming the house into a welcoming refuge from the cold outside. They planted a new garden together in the spring, their hands working the same land, building something new and beautiful together. Neighbors noticed the change. Thomas walked more upright, smiled more often, and there was a lightness to his steps that had not existed before. Elena bloomed like a flower that finally found fertile soil. Her eyes sparkled, her laughter sounded more often through the house, and she moved with the confidence of a loved, happy woman. The following spring, Elena found out she was expecting a child. The news filled Thomas with such deep joy that he had to lean on the fence of the corral when she told it. He had given up the idea of having children, of building a real family. Now, at 43, he would be a father for the first time, and the woman carrying his child was someone he loved more than life itself. Thomas and Elena's son was born on a golden morning in September, exactly 1 year after they had truly fallen in love. He was a strong, healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. Thomas held the baby for the first time with hands that trembled with excitement, his eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. Elena, exhausted but radiant, smiled as she saw the man she had learned to love become a father. They named the boy Samuel, after Thomas's grandfather, but with the silent promise that this Samuel would grow up surrounded by love, not obligations. The Mitchell house, which for generations had echoed with heavy silences and loneliness, now resonated with childlike laughter, affectionate conversation, and the sweet music of a family that had chosen to love each other. 5 years later, when Thomas watched Elena playing in the backyard with Samuel and his little sister Mary, he still felt a deep gratitude for the strange fate that had brought them together. The arranged marriage they both feared had become the foundation of a happiness neither of them had imagined possible. Elena, now 31, had become not only his wife but his best friend, his partner in all aspects of life. What had begun as an obligation had been transformed into devotion. What seemed like a prison had become freedom. The Mitchell Ranch continued to thrive, but it was now more than land and cattle. It was a home built on choices made out of love, not duty. And on starry nights in Texas, when Thomas and Elena sat on the porch, watching their children play in the backyard, they knew they had discovered something rare and precious. They had learned that true love doesn't always come like lightning. Sometimes it grows slowly, like seeds planted in unlikely soil, watered by daily gentleness, and cultivated by the constant choice to care for one another. The lonely man who had been forced to marry his father's widow discovered that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as sacrifices. And the young woman who had married for survival learned that the heart can flourish even in the most arid soil when it finds someone willing to water it with true love. If this story touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more exciting Wild West narratives.